Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 6th chapter in the book of Daniel. This chapter marks a distinct turning point in the narrative. Everything before it describes Daniel's experience under Babylonian captivity. These were the ones who had conquered Judah and Jerusalem and transplanted him there, but he really made the most of it. He was elevated to the functional equivalent of a prime minister on account of his ability to interpret from a blank slate the dream which had so troubled Nebuchadnezzar that he had gathered all his astrologers and wise men and other purveyors of esoteric knowledge together and was threatening to kill them all. And Daniel intervenes, and from a blank slate he not only spares their lives but elevates himself to the center of subordinate operations in the empire which had conquered his people. And we also read that he promoted the three companions of whom we read of in the first chapter. These are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then we read they get into trouble in the third chapter when Nebuchadnezzar himself issues a decree that all will bow to a statue made of him, and while everyone else goes low, these three men remain high. And the word reaches eventually to King Nebuchadnezzar himself, and he summons them there, and they defy him to his face when he asks which Ella can, which of your mighty ones can deliver you from the fire. And he finds out the answer eventually, and he gives testimony and order and issues an order that this the Elohim of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be proclaimed throughout his kingdom. Then in the fourth chapter, we read of a dream and a severe mental condition which had crippled King Nebuchadnezzar, where he literally thought he was a beast of the field and acted as such for a period of 7 years. And then in the fifth chapter, we read that his grandson and successor, Belshazzar, is partying and profaning the sacred items of the Temple of Jerusalem, while the Babylonians are at his gate, and they will penetrate that night and slay him there. So it was the end of his days, end of his numbers. So by this point, the Persians take over, and they wouldn't have been conquerors of the Judeans, but liberators. So it was at their behest that they were allowed to return to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple, but some of them stayed behind to make the most of it. Now Daniel, we read, was naturally transitioned into the post he had performed under Nebuchadnezzar, that being the prime minister, not quite the word, but second in the kingdom, and he is promoted to the same by Cyrus, who is the king who is not mentioned in this. But the opening verse reads, "It pleased Darius to appoint over the kingdom 120 viceroys to be all over the kingdom." So Darius is not the grandson and successor of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, but he was one of his trusted lieutenants who was 62 years old at the time. Darius would not rule until in between the events described herein in the book of Esther, which took place when Xerxes, his son, was king. But the division of his empire was vast enough for him to carve out 120 separate jurisdictions to rule as one, but to treat as separate components in the one. And over them 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, so that these 3 viceroys should give account to them, that the king suffer no loss. So taxing this mighty empire would have given some unscrupulous men license to pilfer what they could from the privilege of being entrusted to guard the flow of money to the king where it belongs. And but unfortunately for them, Daniel is one of the 3 who they have to get through to get to him, and he is a scrupulously and man of integrity who, as we'll read, he doesn't sink to their level when they resort to scheming. He doesn't sink to the same level, and he gets himself in a hot water of trouble. We're going to talk about that when it comes. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and viceroys, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to appoint him over all the reign, so as if being promoted to one of the three trusted people. He had surpassed all the rest, so much so that he was elevated above them to a position of unique authority, which was second only to his. And it was because he was an excellent spirit. The administration flourished as it should, because it would be untainted by corruption with his watch of integrity, and that would have rippled down all the way to these 120 governors. Then the governors and viceroys sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they were unable to find occasion or corruption, because he was steadfast, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. So these jealous courtiers and subordinates of Daniel, whom he had been elevated, they feel, at their expense and entrusted to manage the entire kingdom, he provokes the jealousy of the governors, but the other, and the viceroys, but the other vice it may have been rooted in was greed, because their empires, their side businesses of pilfering off the excess revenue of what belonged to the king, could not flourish under his watch. And so they wanted him gone. They sought a pretext which they could use, and they kept digging and kept searching, but he was incorruptible. Steadfast. He maintained his integrity in spite of their traps and temptations and snares, and he was a competent overseer of the king's affairs. And he was personally incorrupt. He had integrity in all that he did, and so they had nothing they could use against him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, unless we find it against him concerning the law of Elah." So because they can't indict him to any of the rules, they're going to change a rule. They're going to make it an act of treason to bow or pray to any Elohim, they sucker Cyrus in through flattery to pronounce himself the God exclusive to whom exclusive worship was owed for a certain duration of time. We'll explain that when it comes. But they knew he was Jewish, and they knew enough about Judaism to know that as a Jew, he was bound by the law of Moses, even though he was no longer a citizen of his own state. Then these governors and viceroys tumultuously gathered before the king and said this to him, "King Darius, live forever." So right off the bat, they're flattering him. When someone tries to flatter you, they're usually trying to manipulate you. There is such a thing as sincere praise, but beware of flattery. These are the contrived and artificial and unnatural expressions of praise. "All the governors of the kingdom, the nobles and viceroys, the counselors and advisers, have consulted together to establish a royal decree and to make a strong interdict that whomever petitions any mighty one or man for 30 days, except you, O king, is thrown into the den of lions." So the consensus was that they all wanted to do this for this man because they thought him so great and so excellent that he was worthy alone of worship, so much so that it would be a treasonable offense to pay homage to any other deity except him. And this was capital punishment, the worst of the worst, being eaten alive by a den of hungry lions. And but they had gathered in unanimity, but Daniel obviously wasn't consulted. "Now, O king, establish the interdict and sign the writing, so that it is not to be changed, according to the law of the Medos and the Persians, which does not pass away." So even the king was bound by the law that he signed and executed. Once it was in motion, there was nothing even he could do to rescind it. That's just the system of the Persian. They had their own form of check and balance for monarchies. It was a lot less stringent than we Americans know as checks and balance, but it was still something. So King Darius signed the written interdict. He probably didn't even think about it, or didn't give it the reflection or analysis it was due, because he could not see that these men did not have, in fact, his best interest at heart, but were motivated by a pursuit to get rid of someone who did have his best interest at heart, who they were jealous of. And he's going to regret it, at least temporarily, that he set it in motion. But as we read, Daniel will be delivered from the den of the lions. And Cyrus himself, the unnamed king in this or I think, but whatever, he's going to give an expression of praise as eloquent as anything that Moses, Paul, or anyone else ever wrote to the Elohim of the Israelites. And Daniel, when he knew that the writing was signed, went home, and in his upper room with his windows open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times a day, and prayed and gave thanks before his Elah, as he had done before. So he observed a disciplined prayer life, and his prayer was public. He made it known. He didn't shout, but he made himself visible to all, to give the praise and the prayers to Elah, who had guided him and by his grace had elevated him to prosper. And so these conspiratorial courtiers know this, and they're going to use it against him. Now, they had schemed and plotted and conspired, but Daniel remained morally superior to that. He didn't sink to their level. That he could have closed his window, he could have gone outside the city limits to pray, but he was a man of integrity, and he would not continue his disciplined spiritual life just because these conspiring courtiers had a grudge against him. Then these men tumultuously gathered and found Daniel praying and entreating before his Elah. So they caught him in the moment, and he was guilty as charged. They heard him pray, offering it to the one of the ones who was forbidden to have a homage expressed to, as per the edict. Then they approached the king and spoke concerning the king's interdict. Have you not signed an interdict that every man who petitions any mighty one or man within 30 days except you, O king, is thrown into the den of lions? The king answered and said, The word is certain, according to the law of the Medos and Persians, which does not pass away. So he's more concerned about the integrity of the preservation of the law than he is unbeknownst to him, his best interest at this moment. So they had in fact set a trap to remove someone who is useful to them, but a man who they thought got in their ways and whom they were jealous of, and their greed made them murderously motivated to the one who threatened their illicit profit, pilfering enterprise. Then they answered and said, Before the king, Daniel, who is one of the sons of the exile from Judah, pays no heed to you, O king, nor for the interdict that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. So they knew this was something he was going to do, and they wanted to use it against him, and here they did. They rat on him to the king about Daniel, who is at this moment in time and would remain throughout his reign his most trusted and loyal lieutenant. But these less than loyal and envious servants of his were giving him up to the wolves or the lions at this point. Then the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and laid his hand on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. So he immediately regretted it and did what he could do to alleviate it, but unfortunately there was nothing they could do. These nobles were going to hold him to the letter of the law because that was their check and balance, which prevented an unnecessary tyrannical measure. But he was physically involved and invested on his behalf, but to no avail. Then these men tumultuously gathered before the king, and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medos and Persians that any interdict or decree which the king established is not to be changed. So they're alluding to the permanence of any law which his hand signs, and they knew they had recently presented him one that flattered him on surface, but he couldn't calculate the consequences of the signing of that law, but they were going to hold him to it because that's just the type of people they were. Then the king gave orders, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the den of lions. But to the king spoke and said to Daniel, Your Allah, whom you serve continually, he himself delivers you. So it's with sorrow and regret that he parts with Daniel, but it's not. He does have some faith that Daniel's deity, who he probably doesn't even know by name, let alone person, will be powerful enough to deliver him from the lion's den. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signets of his great men, that the situation concerning Daniel might not be changed. So he at least went with the motions of what was required by law, that was to any law that he signed was to be perpetually binding. This one had an expiration date after the 30-day mark. This probably happened closer to the first day of the day because Daniel prayed every day and they would have been out to get him from the beginning. And the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. So he didn't allow him to himself to have fun, as the resources for fun and any pleasure he could want or desire would have been at his disposal. He was concerned and regretful of his own rule. He felt responsible for the fate of his friend, and he could not sleep or eat unless he knew he was alive. He said the right words when parting ways with him, but he does have some doubts at this time. Then the king rose up very early in the morning and hurried to the den of lions. So as soon as he was getting whatever rest he could, the first thing he did was to rush on over to the den of lions to check on the fate of his friend and advisor. And when he came to the den, he called with a grieved voice to Daniel. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living Allah, has your Allah, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? So he could have said anything which demanded a response, but the particular question, as he framed it, was just another way of saying, are you still alive? Answer me in any way, shape, or form. Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. So this might have been the customary greeting. This mirrors that which was said, or at least mimics that which was said by the conspiring courtiers when they presented the written law, which they conspired to have him sign so they could remove Daniel, but not a scratch came upon him in the den of hungry lions, and there's a lot less detail as to the incident from which he was delivered in than what we read of in the 3rd chapter of Daniel. I recently did one on that. You can type in Corey Johnston Daniel 3 to learn of the 3 companions who endured their real test and trial of faith during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel experienced his almost instantly when he was flourishing almost immediately upon the transfer of power from Nebuchadnezzar to Cyrus. My Allah has sent his angel and has shut the lion's mouth, and they did not harm me, because I was found innocent before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm. So the all-seeing, all-knowing eye in the sky had justified him of being guilty as charged to defy the king, which he didn't, strictly speaking, do. And he didn't harm him or mean him any offense. He just he gave unto God what was God, and unto Caesar what was Caesar's. And it is a dishonor to God to worship Caesar. You can serve him to the best of your ability with integrity, but you cannot worship him when you belong to him. And because he maintained his integrity in spite of the deadly consequences, the potentially deadly consequences, he was protected through the ordeal by an angel who kept the lion's mouth shut. We could imagine they were starved enough to be hungry so as to tear up the human victim almost instantly in making a more gruesome spectacle. But he had no reason to be eaten because he had done no wrong. Then the king was very glad and gave orders that Daniel be taken up out of the den. And Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no harm was found on him, because he trusted in his Ella. So the secret to surviving such an ordeal, which almost defies the imagination, it was his trust and faith in Ella, Elohim, Yahweh, whoever you want to call him. His strength was in his superior and higher power, and that was what delivered him. Now, he certainly had faith when confronting the lions, but he was willing to die. The fact that he was willing to die for his faith was all the confirmation that Yahweh needed to spare his life if put to the trial, because he had a plan and purpose for Daniel that was not yet finished. As we read, this is the Persian period is in a lot of ways a more prolific period of revelation of which we read from Daniel. Then the king gave orders, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they threw them, their children, and their wives into the den of lions. And the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they reached the door of the den. So the conspirators, or at least some of them, did not count on, one, Daniel surviving, two, the king even knowing he had been deceived, and responded accordingly to their betrayal. But just as Mordecai erected the gallows that he himself would be hung on, they had laid their own trap. This brings to mind passages such as Psalm 10:2. Then King Darius wrote to all the people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, "Peace be increased to you." So he was a world empire who had a global reach. He ruled 120 territories from as far west as Turkey and Libya, and as far east as India. So he had a vast semi-continent under his control, and he had many subjects, but he addresses them, all of them at once. "From before me is made a decree that throughout every rule of my kingdom men are to tremble and fear before the Ella of Daniel, for he is the living Ella and steadfast forever, and his reign is one which is not destroyed, and his rule is unto the end." So he gives a powerful and dramatic testimony of the eternal nature and the eternal power of Daniel, so much so that he considers him to be worthy of worship throughout his entire domain, the one who had delivered his most faithful and efficient and useful servant had impressed upon his mind that he was real, he was living, and he could save Daniel from any dilemma. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. And he has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel, whom they would have known, not everyone would have known of his prime minister by name, but a lot of his population would. But once more, he attaches him to him. So this is the one who had delivered Daniel. This is the Elohim of Daniel, and Daniel belongs to him. And because he did, he was rescued from all but certain death. And this is the same Elohim who performs miracles throughout the sky, throughout the earth, and everywhere in between throughout the cosmos. And this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, and in the reign of Koresh the Persian. So his apex of influence extends not across one, but two Persian emperors, these names aren't aligned or reflective of the traditional names the historical names by which we know the Persian kings. But in any case, that's not necessarily what's important. What is important is communicated throughout this passage, that if you are uncompromising and unwavering in your devotion to the path that you are called to walk on, even all the way unto death, you may yet save your life if you do not value your life above the life you have now, above the one that awaits you. So I hope that's the reason you're here, but that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take care till then. Bye-bye.